All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a virtual fireside chat with Howard Gardner and Susan Noyes. Howard Gardner is the Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a recipient of the Macarthur Genius Grant, the Prince of Asturias Award for Social Sciences, and the Brock International Prize in Education. He has received honorary degrees from 31 colleges and universities. He has studied and written extensively about intelligence, creativity, leadership, and professional ethics, and is Senior Director of Project Zero and co-founder of the Good Work Project. We are so grateful that you are here, Howard. Susan Noyes, founder and publisher of Make It Better Media Group, also joins us today and will guide the discussion as well as moderate your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And thank you again, Howard, for joining us. Thanks to that Macarthur Genius Grant that you won in early days, Howard was able to flesh out his revolutionizing concept of multiple intelligences, which was described in his 1983 groundbreaking book, Frames of Mind. His books also include Good Work, Changing Minds, The Development and Education of the Mind, Multiple Intelligences, New Horizons, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed. I love that title. I'm going to say it again. Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, and The App Generation. He has recently completed a national study of higher education detailed in a forthcoming book, The Real World of College and What Higher Education Is and What It Can Be. But it is this book, his recently published memoir, A Synthesizing Mind, that prompted today's conversation. With multiple intelligences theory, Howard taught the world that humans don't have just one intelligence, the kind measured by IQ tests, but rather that they have many intelligences, including emotional, musical, kinesthetic, and others. It is not an overstatement to say that Howard's theory transformed education around the world. Parents and educators quickly embraced the opportunity to think more holistically about children, focusing more attention on their strengths and reframing concepts like disabilities to different abilities. Schools of thought and entire school systems have developed around Howard's insights. He has earned even more awards than we mentioned before. Most interestingly, entrepreneurs developed enterprises earning millions of dollars around Howard's pioneering work, but tellingly, Howard didn't. He stayed true to his original research-driven mission and loyal to Harvard University, where he was originally educated and became a tenured professor and still leads Project Zero. I am truly Howard's fangirl because as I was raising 6 children with very different abilities, it made a lot of sense for me to look at each one through the lens of different kinds of strengths and emphasizing and nurturing those intelligences as opposed to focusing and really perseverating over their IQ, about which I could do absolutely nothing, and their poor organizational skills. And so many parents felt similarly. As we now know, education around the world transformed. So I had the great opportunity, good fortune to join the Harvard Graduate School of Education Visiting Committee. And I really did it, as I told Harvard, because I didn't know him at the time, but I was such a fan. I wanted to learn more deeply about it. And once that happened, I learned how many other values Howard and I share, a deep love of family and a true belief that if we transform education for all children, we transform the world for the better faster than anything else. So when you published your memoir, I ate it up and I reveled in every story that you told about your own family of origin and what family means to you. And I would love to start the conversation with, please tell everybody else about your family of origin and how that influenced your work.
Well, thank you, Susan. That's quite an introduction. I think it may have set a record for superlatives. I hope I don't undermine them all in the next half hour or so. Let me just say a word about the memoir, and then I'll talk about my family. I reached what we might call the memoir age some years ago, and I began to reflect on my life, and particularly on my intellectual life, on my work and my thinking and so on. And I realized, kind of to my surprise, that my theory of multiple intelligences, which I think most people know a bit about, didn't really explain how I worked, what kind of strengths I had, how my own mind worked. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later. I decided that I had a fairly typical academic mind, pretty good in language, pretty good in logic. But what was distinctive about me as a scholar, a teacher, a researcher, is I have a synthesizing mind, which is, and very briefly, I have a lot of junk in here, picked up in all sorts of ways, and I spent a lot of time trying to organize it and reorganizing it in order to make sense of things like creativity, leadership, things that you mentioned, intelligence. So the synthesizing mind is kind of a doing to myself what I've done to other people over the last 30 or 40 years, trying to understand how their mind worked. Okay, so the first thing about my biography, autobiography, which may be the only thing people will remember, is that I was born in the same place and at the same time as Joe Biden. Joe Biden was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in late 1942. I was born in the middle of 1943. So in 2 months, I'll be the same age as him, as he is. We didn't know each other. He was an Irish Catholic. I was the son of German Jewish immigrants who escaped Nazi Germany just in time. And I mean that literally. They arrived in New York City on Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, the shattering glass, when Nazi thugs and hoodlums went through cities, including Nuremberg, where my parents lived, and destroyed temples and went into people's homes and threw relatives out the window. Some of them died. And I was very lucky to be around because, if my family hadn't been allowed in the country, my parents would have died in a concentration camp. So when I hear about immigrants, they aren't people, they're other people's problems. They're things which have a lot of meaning for me. Anyway, I grew up in Scranton. I was a good student and very interested in music, and could have been a pianist of some ability. But when I turned 12, my teacher, who was actually 95 years old, that seems old to me even now, said, "Well, Howard, I've taken you as far as you can go. Now you're going to have to go to New York and work 3 hours a day." And I made an instant decision, which I think was the right one, which was that I wasn't going to become a professional pianist. But I have a lifelong interest in the arts. And when I became a social scientist and then a psychologist, I went to work at a place called Project Zero, which Susan mentioned, which was an effort to do systematic thinking about the arts. And the man who founded Project Zero was a philosopher named Nelson Goodman, said, there's lots of lore about music and dance and theater and literature and poetry and sculpture, but there's very little systematic knowledge. So we're going to call our research project Project Zero. And I was a founding member of that project 54 years ago. And I actually co-ran it for 28 years. I'm now the head of the steering committee, which sounds more important than it really is, but my life's been spent there. And I think I should say one other thing and then turn it back to Susan. I've been incredibly lucky in my life. I've been reasonably healthy. I've had a wonderful family. And I was lucky enough to get into Harvard College in 1961. In those days, 1 out of 3 people got into Harvard. This year, it was fewer than 4%. Susan's kids fall somewhere in between the 33% and the 3%. And I've spent my life there. And I was lucky enough to be growing up in the 50s and 60s, a time when America was expanding, less troubled than it is today. And I was white, male, and I had an easier time than if I'd been a minority or if I'd been a woman. And so in that sense, I've had a blessed life. I've tried to do the best kind of work I can. It's up to other people to judge how successful I am. So that's a kind of a glimpse. I have sister who lives in Boston near me, Marin, who actually told me I was doing this program because a friend of hers sent her a note. And I have got 4 kids and 5 grandchildren. And since we're all poked now, I've been able to see them all. And that's, of course, been wonderful because everybody's been cooped up for over a year.
And you have a blended family, which that's increasingly common, but I'm sure your perspective has been affected by that.
Yes, blended in the sense that I was married and then got divorced, and my first wife died in a tragic accident, and remarried and adopted a child from Taiwan, and all of them have kids now, and I think it's a good family. I certainly live for the family. That's what Jay and his family are showing up this Friday, and we're already planning what we're going to be doing over the weekend. And the other kids have all been up here already, meeting in Cambridge.
And I am sure that you've had countless parents ask you how to use your theory of multiple intelligences to be wise parents. And what's the best advice you give them?
I guess the most important thing is to watch your child very carefully, listen to your child very carefully. Don't try to project who you are and what your strengths are onto the child. Instead, and I always talk about children's museums because almost everybody lives in a place near a children's museum. Go with your child starting at a young age and watch what the child gets interested in, what he or she fools around with, and then importantly, on subsequent trips, do they go back there? And if they go back there, are they just ritualistically repeating themselves, or are they exploring it and trying out new kinds of things? You don't have to go to a children's museum. You can go out into the country. You can go to a park. You can go into a busy city, though, of course, you've got to hold the hand carefully. But the important thing is to let your child show you what he or she is interested in and then encourage it. Clearly, education is important, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about formal education. But I think a big mistake that parents make, and I'm sure I wasn't immune from it, is to try to project onto kids what the parents were like and what they most want the kids to be like, rather than to let the child flower in ways that make sense for the child. And what we all hope is our kids will eventually develop good character and a sense of purpose, a mission, a reason for living other than just breathing or even just having fun, but doing something that's meaningful for yourself and for the world. And ever since developing the multiple intelligences idea, I've really been focusing what we call good work, which is how to use your intelligences and your ambitions and your purpose and your mission to do not just what's good for you, but what's good for a wider group. And I think that's one reason Susan and I connected, is because that's very much her philosophy as well.
Thanks for that shout out. That's exactly right. So can you talk a little bit about what your ideal schools and school districts and formal educational environments look like that are most likely to foster exactly that in a child?
In how many minutes? All right, well, let me, as they say, let me riff a bit about this. Years ago, I said, if I was the czar, I would send my infant to the French school system, the preschooler to the Italian school system, the young child in school to Japanese school system, then the older child to the Finnish school system, then the high school, secondary school to Western Europe, and the United States to college and university. And that's a way of saying that different societies have had different strengths in their educational system. And I'm sure you could apply the same thing with the United States. I'm sure there are places which have good preschools and good secondary schools and good colleges and universities. I don't think it makes sense to prescribe an ideal school for every child. And that's why it's good that we can have some choice in this country. Obviously, the more means you have, the more choice you have. But I frankly wouldn't want to send my children to a school where the local school board had a philosophy which I didn't like. Of course, that happens in many places. But I do also have something will reflect my own recent work, and Susan alluded to that. All over the world, there's no disagreement. We want kids to be literate. That means we want them to be able to read, write, calculate, and now I would say compute. That goes without question. Before the kids leave their formal training, we want them to be ready to take a job and to move into the wider world. So we might say that there's literacy and there's livelihood. What I'm most interested in, and Susan alluded to this, are the years in between literacy and livelihood. In any reasonable school system, and I know that many school systems aren't reasonable, kids are reasonably literate by the age of 8, 9. They can read, they can write, they can do standard arithmetic. When we talk about being prepared for a vocation, I don't think that should happen before college or even before graduate school. This gives 5 to 10 years for what I would call disciplinary learning or liberal arts learning. And that is to become interested in all the things that human beings have learned about the world, the natural world, physical world, the world of experience, history, the world of philosophy, big questions human beings have tried to answer, the world of social science, what we understand about human beings and how we develop and how we work together and so on. And so I call that the period between the literacies and livelihoods. And when Susan referred to my book, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, the goal of that book is to talk about how, in a very difficult age, our age, I don't mean child age, I mean 21st century, to help kids have a sense of truth when there's so much lying and fake news around, how to have a chance of goodness when we have so many examples of people who are misbehaving at the highest levels, I can say, and a sense of beauty. The wonderful thing about beauty is everybody can have his or her own sense of beauty, but that should change. The analogy that I use is food. 5-year-olds love foods, and that's fine. But they would probably be happy to go to McDonald's for the rest of their lives. But one of the things you can develop as you get older is a palate. If you be interested in different kinds of fruits and vegetables and meats, if you're not a vegetarian, and different kinds of cuisines like French and Vietnamese and you name it. Similarly, with beauty, I loved Disney movies as much as anybody when I was 5 or 10. But to be acquainted with the artworks from all over the world, from traditions which we know well as opposed to traditions which we don't know well, those tend to be from overseas, and to see how the arts and literature and poetry have changed and deepened and connected across life, that's beauty. And we can all have our own sense of beauty. Nobody needs to dictate what it is. And that gives us more of a free run. We can't simply say, truth is what I think it is. There are methods to deciding what's true and what's not. And we can't simply say, goodness is what I think is good, because we could have real disagreements and maybe we wouldn't even ultimately agree. But beauty is infinite. There's no limit on it. And so to summarize my long answer to your question, Susan, I would like every child, before he or she goes out into the workplace, to have a sense of how to find out what's true and to be prepared to change your mind if you find out that you're wrong, how to identify what you value, what you feel that the world should be like, and how to work cooperatively to achieve that, and then to have developing sense of beauty. And it should continue as long as you're alive and your senses are still operating. So that's kind of a philosophical answer to your question, but it's also what I believe.
It's a fabulous answer. And you hit the nail on the head when you said, well, affluent parents, it's pretty easy for them to find those opportunities for their kids. Are there tools or resources that you recommend for the parents who are less fortunate?
I wish that I was more of an expert in what's available online and how easy it is to access it. I mean, I just read a poignant story in the newspaper the last day or so about some mother who had to rush home from work because she was the only person who had a device on which her child could do the homework. And probably that's not a situation of most people who are watching this particular video cast. But I guess if you have a choice within your community, you certainly should exercise that choice. That's part of the idea of a charter school. If you don't have a choice, you can try to become involved with the school administration, with other parents, with the school board. You may not want to run for office, but you might want to attend the meetings. And everybody has access to television. I don't think there's anybody in this country who doesn't. But what do you watch? It's very different on Saturday morning just to watch cartoons than it is to watch something that's more educational. And I know from my own experience with kids and grandkids, when parents sit with their children and watch television or read books or go on walks, it has entirely different meaning than when you just plunk the kid there and you go off and do your own thing, or indeed plunk the kid there and busy doing your email. My parents did not have higher education because Hitler came to power and they had to leave. And we were quite, I wouldn't say impoverished when we were young, but we had no extra money. So there's more of a burden on the parents to do things which you might be able to pay somebody else to do if you have more, if you have more assets. I mean, we had grandparents living with us and aunts and uncles, and we try to learn from them. So I guess I'm wondering, you have to be opportunistic if you don't have a big bank account. And we all are inspired by people whom we read about every day who came from very modest surroundings and were able to make something of themselves. I have a wonderful assistant, and I only learned this about her yesterday, even though she's worked with me for quite a while. She came from a very indigent background. I'm not going to talk about her name, though I'm proud of her. And she went to a high school, and the high school had no money, but there was debating there. And she said the biggest difference, if you want to do what's called policy debate, which I'd never heard of, it's very much like chess. It's very carefully regulated and so on. And you've said if you have a lot of affluence, you can hire people, you can have buses to go to debating. They had nothing, had to sell cookies to get to go to the one debate a year. But she became a good debater. She then got a debating scholarship to college. I'd never heard about that before. And now she's getting a doctorate in history. She probably did what not everybody can do, but it is a country where if you're motivated and opportunistic, you can make something of yourself. And, I've been reading about my fellow Scrantonians' plans for the United States. It's clear that Biden wants to make early education available to everybody. I think that's more likely than making free college available to everybody. But society is nuts if it doesn't invest a lot in its young people. And if you look at China and Finland, which in various ways are at the top of all of these rankings, it's because they know how important kids are. Somebody my age has benefited from the fact that there's more legislation for old people in this country because the senators are old and old people vote more, but that's not a good way to build a future.
No, and we spend more on healthcare in the last year of life far more than we do in, pediatric care and research. It's very interesting. But let's go back to the positives that you just brought up. I know that you are a big fan of a particular type of early childhood education. So if you were going to get to wave your magic wand and have all the money invested in the United States in a great early childhood education, what would that look like?
Well, you may be hinting at the fact that I've been very inspired by schools in northern Italy, which began, now it's 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, in a community called Reggio Emilia. And this affected me more than any other educational system I've ever seen. So I made many trips there. And our group at Project Zero has been working with the people in Reggio for decades. And what's distinctive about the education in Reggio? First of all, it's a community effort. They're community schools, so it's not only available to people who have means. If there are too many people who apply, the kids come in by lottery. I think if you have a sibling, it may help you get into these preschools or infant toddler schools, as they call them. And in those schools, they pick something that interests the kids, and then the kids develop projects around these things. Projects could be anything from the lion in the town square to spaghetti, which people like, to shoes, to a birdhouse. And you'd say, yeah, well, that'd be good for a day or maybe a week, but they will spend months on the project. And the kids work together in teams to try to learn about these interests, and then to build things. They can be now on computers, they can be out of clay, they can draw things, they can make tunes, and they can song, they can write stories about it. And these topics became organizing methods for the whole way that school runs. My older kids went to a good school in Cambridge called Shady Hill, where they had a subject matter each year. Egypt one year, Greece another year. And this is bringing the same idea, but not about a country, but rather about stuff like a pen or a piece of paper or a drinking glass into the kids' lives. Then they have in the class what they call pedagogistas, which means sort of teachers who know something about the subject matter, and atellistas, which, as the name implies, are people who know about how to work with materials. And so if they're working with clay, or they're working with music, or they're working with computing, to help the kids do hands-on kinds of things, because that's how kids, when they're 3 or 4, learn about things. Everything in the school is documented. It's photographed, it's written about in paper and pencil. Now I'm sure that it's also posted online. And then the learnings are posted all around the school. And this documentation is taken as seriously as what happens in the classroom. And every day after school, the teachers get together and talk about what happened, what worked well, what didn't work well, what should we do better, and then they post that. So it's a continuous learning for the teachers as well as for the students. And I've never seen a community in which parents are as involved in the school as in Reggio. And that's not only because education is very important there, but because there's such regular reporting to the parents about what's going on with each of their kids, and importantly, with the group. They don't believe in individual learning. They believe in learning as a group. And so if Susan is in a group of 5 people and she's absent one day, they say, what would Susan do? And they try to fill her particular role. And in our study of college, which we both mentioned briefly, we discovered that when you talk to American college students, we talked to 1,000 college students, and we transcribed everything that they said. The word I was used by American college students 11 times as often as the word we. And if I wanted to give you one bit of data with what's wrong with our country, it's the focus on I. And Reggio, and this will be interesting to you to know if you're a little bit beyond words, Reggio is for decades a communist part of the country. And communism in this country is like saying death. But this is communism in the sense of a commune where people work together to do things which were good for the community. It wasn't at all totalitarian. In fact, it was politically very, very contentious. So I'm wandering again, but since you asked, when I said earlier I would send my kids to preschool in Northern Italy, I wanted to send them to a Reggio school. And there are Reggio schools all over the world. Something called Reggio Children, which anybody can just access on the web, describes schools. And like everything else, including Gardner schools or multiple intelligence schools, which you alluded to, you have to look beyond the label. I couldn't care less whether people call a school a Gardner school or an MI school. I care about whether they're doing sorts of stuff which makes sense. So similarly, it's nice if people quote Reggio, or they quote something having to do with me, but you have to go there and talk to parents and watch and use your multiple intelligences.
So you like schools that teach people to tackle problems, think it through, to work collaboratively, that get parents and teachers in stronger dialogue. The whole community is sort of watching out for the individual child. Is that right?
Not only is it right, but I could have given a much shorter answer if I just listened to you. And as you talk, I realize it really is John Dewey's vision of school. I'm sure people who are watching are many of you will be educators, and you know something about John Dewey. And the big influences on Reggio were John Dewey, Maria Montessori, and Piaget, who was also the big influence on my thoughts. But the genius was a man named Loris Malaguzzi, who was 1924 to 1994. And he was the one who took post-war Italy, which was a wreck in every sense. And he saw that many families had no children. There was no education available. And he worked with many people, mostly women, in the 60s and 70s to develop this system, which is now world famous. And as I said, he was contentious. When people argued with him, he argued right back. But I think that Malaguzzi and the Reggio schools are as important as Dewey schools were 100 years ago and Montessori schools were 80 years ago. And I love to see the Reggio ideas moving up. At Project Zero, our research group, Mara Krzyzewski, who's worked with them for 20 or 30 years, has worked through Reggio ideas in elementary grade, middle school, going into high school. Because there's nothing about what Susan said that's restricted to 4 and 5-year-olds. It can be done even in college. And I think that, some of the colleges which developed in the mid of the 20th century in the United States, like Bennington or Black Mountain, were Dewey influenced, but you could have said they were Reggio influenced as well.
Could you speak a little bit about where your theories have been misused, please?
You ask these questions, which could lead to a very long answer.
A short one.
Yeah. I'm going to give 2 examples. One, which I've written about extensively, is in 1993, I learned that in one of the Australian states, they were using my ideas, and they created a chart with all of the different racial and ethnic groups in Australia, and of course there's all kinds there, in which intelligence they had and which ones they lacked. And I said, oh my God, this is a disaster. It's exactly what I don't want to have happen. And that was life-changing because I began the next year with colleagues to work on what we call good work or the good project, how to use multiple intelligences in a constructive way. The other thing, which is sort of humorous to people who are in the United States, but it wouldn't be humorous if you were in India or China, is to believe in dermatoglyphics. Dermatoglyphics is a fancy way of saying you can look at people's fingerprint and say which intelligence they have and what their life sources are. And it doesn't matter how often I write to people and say this is nonsense, there's not a shred of evidence for it. People just go on believing it. But thanks to Susan and her husband, Nick, about 10 or 15 years ago, we set up a website called Multiple Intelligences Oasis.org. And there we try to deal with the misconceptions. But I'll tell you one thing I've learned in long life. There's one kind of person that you don't spend time trying to argue with. And that's what I call a fundamentalist. Fundamentalist has nothing to do with religion. Fundamentalist means you have a commitment not to change your mind. And if you believe the fingerprints hold the clue to everything, and like astrology, and you can predict a person's life from that, there's no way I'm going to convince you that it's wrong. And in those 2 countries I mentioned, but I'm sure in other countries as well, there are a lot of people who believe your life is in your fingerprints.
On the palm of your hand. Okay, here's an interesting question. Do you think that fraternal boy-girl twins benefit from being in separate classrooms?
I don't have an informed opinion about that. I think it's much more how parents and teachers think about things. If you try to either emphasize their similarity or their difference rather than just treating them as individuals, that's not a good idea. But I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other. My close colleague, Wendy Fishman, has identical twin boys, both of whom went to school together and are now graduating from the University of Michigan, and they do fine. So I don't have a philosophy about that. I don't know what Leah thinks, but she probably has her own ideas.
If I heard you right, you just think that those Leah and any parents should just observe their child closely and sort of follow their intuition and their lead for what their kids are telling them, right? Are they happier apart or are they happier together?
Right. Also, I think that most of us have siblings. There's always going to be competition as well as collaboration with siblings, and it's how you handle it. Our job is to help each child, whether he looks just like his sibling or very different, to find something that works for them and that isn't just for them. It's we, not just I.
I like that. Here's another question. What do you recommend for a special needs 17-year-old who needs a home tutor and has added, and in addition to that, has developmental delays, autism, and some dyslexia? He has been in various schools, bullied, and not learned to read or write at a higher level either. Due to the poor education and misdiagnosis. Oh, that's a lot of issues for that poor 17-year-old. What is your best advice for that parent?
Signal the child that you believe that things are going to be okay, that the child has the support that he or she needs. And when I wrote a book about leadership, there was one thing I learned, which it took me many years to really work through. And that was what Jean Monnet, who started the European Union, said: I regard every defeat as an opportunity. In my life, when something didn't work, I often got angry, and kicked the dog, or complained. But if instead, when something doesn't work, you say, what can you learn from it? What can be better next time? How can you help yourself and others? I think that attitude is very, very important. So it would be malpractice of me to say what you should do with your particular child. I would have to do the counseling and the testing, which I don't even know how to do. But having faith and giving a positive interpretation of things which work well, but also things that don't work well, is a tremendous gift, and one that I've tried to give to my children and grandchildren.
We have a lot more questions coming in, so if we could go on a little bit longer than 45 minutes, we might appreciate that. So where can I find a good tutor for a special needs 17-year-old for literacy and other issues? Again, in the community that you're in, you need to talk with people whom you respect and say, are there some young people? They could be college kids or people who are just out of college, or they could be grandparents who not only have the skills to train these things, to nurture these things, but who could form a relationship with the child, which is meaningful. I got a wonderful letter today, and I shared it with my wife and with my colleagues, and they all loved it. It was from a very good law professor whom I know named John Bliss, who talked about how when he was in studying law and he was not very happy with it, he wrote a letter to Noam Chomsky, who's probably the world's leading intellectual. And Chomsky, to his amazing, wrote back and gave him some career advice. And John Bliss's idea was, how many of us have been affected lifelong by somebody older who took the trouble to pay attention to us and to give us some good advice? In my book, I write about mentoring. In fact, I dedicate my memoir to mentors. But I also talk about anti-mentors and tormentors and fragmenters. Yes.
Anti-mentors is the one person I don't want to be like is so-and-so. fragmenter, which I did a lot of, is I like this aspect of this person, and this aspect of this person, and this aspect of this person, and how that, I mean, I put it together in myself. So I would say you need to find somebody who obviously has the skills. You wouldn't want someone to teach chess if the person wasn't a good chess player, but somebody who the child can identify with. And since mentoring is always two ways, and the mentor can also identify with the child. I would say one thing I've realized, and it's not to my credit, but it's to my credit I realized it, that as a mentor, it's been easier for me to mentor people who superficially are like me. I think the greater challenge is to mentor people who are very different from you. And I think that's one of the big things now with that we're learning about as we get more awareness about diversity and intersectionality and so on, is it's not just enough to be a good mentor or role model for someone where you see yourself in. You have to try to do it for people where, at least superficially, they seem to be very different for you, and that's tough. But it's better to be aware of that than not to be aware of it.
Yeah, and even for people like me, I'm not saying this about you, who might be at the mentoring stage of life and not think of myself as needing a mentee, I think I actually need to intentionally go identify mentors who are different. And that's how we all become sort of intentionally broader minded in the process, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I wish I had realized it earlier. I mean, at Harvard College this year, 60% of the students admitted were minorities. When I went to Harvard College in 1961, you could count on two hands the number of Black and Asians in the class, and the class was no smaller. What a different world.
Yeah, it is. All right. Is there anything else you want to tell us before we say goodbye?
Yes, I do. In this memoir, A Synthesizing Mind, I make the claim that in the 21st century, the ability to synthesize, to take a huge amount of information and organize it in ways that are useful, in ways that you can be transmitted, is going to be the most important skill. Because anything you can look up easily, you don't have to do research on. But taking lots of information and organizing it and reorganizing it until ways that it can be useful to yourself and others is something that we don't have much experience in. And that's because psychologists cannot model synthesizing in the lab. If I bring you in, Susan, for an hour test, I can ask you to find some words. I can give you some math problems. I can have you draw something. I can ask you to name something. But I can't say, here's a lot of information and keep putting it together in ways that you think make sense and then test them with other people. And so, because I think the synthesizing mind has been essentially invisible, not only did I write a book about this, but I now have a website called A Synthesizing Mind, and I blog about synthesizing. And I'll give you one amusing blog. I became interested in what it means to synthesize in the world of finance. So I decided to study George Soros and Warren Buffett, who each have made a lot of money, right? I discovered something which I may have been the first person to discover. They were both born in August of 1930. So they're both 90 years of age. Soros acts first and then thinks later. Buffett thinks forever and then acts. But when Buffett acts, he sticks with it. When Soros acts, if it doesn't work, he drops it right away. These are two entirely different ways to do finance, but neither of them could do it at all if they didn't have a huge amount of information in their head. That's synthesizing in finance. I just posted yesterday about synthesizing by my favorite playwright, Tom Stoppard, because I think he's an incredibly good synthesizer in all different kinds of fields. So yeah, the one thing I would say is, even if you're not interested in my memoir, you should be interested in The Synthesizing Mind, because that's going to be at a premium for the next decades.
Okay, I have to say one more thing. This person writes, I have loved your teaching since our children were in grade school. I did not feel at that time that schools addressed multiple intelligences. Now, as a grandparent, I see my grandson is both alike and different from both of his parents. How, as grandparents, do we help our grandchildren learn?
Good question. And my wife, Ellen, and I have both been working with our grandchildren remotely because we couldn't see them for a year. And in some ways, it's easy for grandparents to work with their grandchildren for parents because we aren't fighting about things all the time. But I think the one bit of advice I can say is you need to help kids with things you know how to do, but you can't force it on them. It's got to be a dialogue and a dialectic. And if the stuff you know about is not where the child is at and you can't nurture them in, you shouldn't try to push it, but see, as I said earlier, what the child is interested in, maybe in a Reggio kind of way, and see if you can take your expertise and use it on that topic. So to use sort of a trivial example, if you want to read novels to your grandchild and help the child read that, but the kid is really interested in history and biography, put the novels aside and watch a historical movie and then read about that. And I think both Ellen and I have learned it's kind of assimilation and accommodation. You don't forget what you know, but you don't just try to impose it on the child as well. And you don't have to say, do your homework, which of course has caused battles ever since homework was devised, well before you and I were around, Susan.
And I love that parents now have that lens to watch their kids and think about, okay, where do they really respond? Are they kinesthetic? Are they musical? Oh, do they really love the arts? Oh, do they love the natural world? The gift that you have given parents and grandparents and educators for how to think about and put your kids is spectacular. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks for the opportunity to wander a bit, but also to try to engage the questions as best I could.
Great. And we will follow up. We'll package this article up, and I'm going to make sure that we link to that blog post that you just mentioned, because who doesn't want to at least think about synthesizing like George Soros and Warren Buffett, right?
Sure.
Right. Thanks so much, Howard.
Thank you, Susan. Good to see you.
Bye-bye.